Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Daily Coast, The Brief, our weekly show about politics. I'm Marcos Molitzas. I am here with co-host Carrie Alaveld, and today we're going to have a great show. We're going to be talking to Julián Castro. You last saw him running for president back in, what was it, last time?
2020. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
And he is making some noise down in Texas. So we're going to be asking him. It looks like he's making some rumblings about maybe running for office next year. And Democrats are feeling pretty feisty about Texas. And we've been talking about Texas a lot, Carrie. Even last week, we had Cristina Cinsun Ramirez, who ran for Senate last cycle in Texas. And we talked a lot about Texas. And we're going to talk about Texas some more. Texas really is becoming the battleground to end all battlegrounds. I mean, if we can get Texas to flip at the Senate level, get some of those House seats, and the presidential level, really makes it hard for Republicans to compete at various levels. So it's becoming a very critically important state, also a very complicated state, a very expensive state, a very big state, and the Democratic base in Texas isn't very well performing, doesn't really turn out at the polls. So there's a lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunity. And so I'm sure we'll be talking to Secretary Castro about those topics when he comes on at the top of the hour. But right now, Carrie, you have been writing a lot about Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. It's almost becoming like your obsessive beat, because it actually is quite a fascinating story. It's what happens to a governor that willfully and negligently basically kills off a substantial part of his constituency and the way things are going right at this point, his base. And so you've been keeping a really close eye on that. What are you seeing right now, Carrie?
Well, and just to make sure that we can include Governor Greg Abbott of Texas in that same, like they're kind of the top two Republican governors who are like personal freedom at all costs, yeah. And, kids under 12, well, they're just on their own. Good luck. Sorry, kids. I mean, that has basically been their, mantra through this. But I'm sure we'll get into the politics of Texas with Secretary Castro. So in terms of Florida and DeSantis, I mean, first of all, I know that Florida always breaks the hearts of Democrats, right? I mean, every year it's like a little bit bigger heartbreak, and 2018 was no exception. When DeSantis got elected, 2020 was no exception. So anyway, but in 2018, DeSantis won election by 0.3% of the vote. I mean, it was not it was under half a point.
It was a Florida election.
Right. It was standard. Under half a point.
Yes.
Right. So this is a guy now who decided that, I mean, first of all, just to give a brief history, he went to the White House in 2019 while Trump was still president. Sorry, in 2020 while Trump was still president. And in May of 2020 declared, victory over the coronavirus. Well, that was really smart. 2 months later, he had to backtrack. Not even 2 months. Within a month, he had to backtrack, and he had to order closures of bars and stuff because they were having a huge surge there. I think when the Delta surge came around, he and people like Governor Abbott staked the claim on, we're gonna champion personal freedom and individual liberty at all costs, right? And I think maybe at the beginning of this, they thought that the Delta surge wouldn't be that bad, wouldn't go on so long. It would kind of fade from memory quickly, and then they could come out saying, hey, I was always, when they make their GOP presidential bid, I was always for personal freedom, and I never let up on that, right? I never took my foot off the pedal. Unfortunately, in both their states, the COVID cases have just exploded. And I feel like I could be wrong. I think that they painted themselves into a corner that they couldn't get out of. So they've tried to like walk this line of having it both ways, where they're like mildly supportive of vaccines. You know, like DeSantis had one throwaway line in a speech where he said that vaccines were saving lives. And so now he's quote unquote pro-vaccine, right? But at the same time, he's literally gone to war with anyone, any school official, any local official who wants to mandate masking, who wants to mandate vaccines in any way. He has banned local mask mandates. And just recently, his Board of Education, handpicked by the Florida governor, has said that it's going to punish 2 counties in Florida that implemented universal in-school masking. They're not the only ones. They were among the first. Now there's about a handful of some of the biggest school districts in that state that are, including Miami-Dade and Broward, that are doing universal in-school masking. And now the Board of Education is saying, hey, we're going to dock your pay for that. Those top school officials, members of the board, are going to have docked pay.
So I want to stress 2 points that you've sort of made. I think they're very important points. One of them is some of these Republicans have made, including Donald Trump too, do sort of slip in the get vaccinated, but it's a throwaway line. And it's clear what they're doing is because they know they're going to get hit in the general election. They need to first get through the primary, right? So it's going to be all about personal freedom. They're going to get hit. But what happens in the general election when a Democrat starts saying you got people killed by being anti-vaccine, they can then run that 3-second clip, right? And they think that that's going to inoculate them. It might. I don't know. You know, who knows? The fact that Donald Trump almost won despite 500,000 dead Americans, still, like, I still haven't gotten over that. So I still don't quite.
I also think that's the reason he lost. He almost won, but I also still think that's the reason he lost.
Probably.
So anyway, yeah.
The second part that you were mentioning, though, is that Republicans, for whatever reason, have decided that they're going to go to war with schools. They've literally launched a defund the schools movement in order to keep kids from being safe. And this, to me, becomes a much more difficult sort of tactic to defend in any kind of general election. You're literally, I mean, Carrie, you're a parent, I'm a parent, right? We fight to keep our kids safe.
Yeah.
And suddenly, because of QAnon or because of Facebook craziness, I don't even know why, you have Republicans literally fighting to make their kids less safe. And Carrie, you've seen, I know you've got the numbers offhand, right? But this is not particularly popular. I don't think it's really selling well in broad America, is it? This notion that you punish schools for trying to keep our kids safe.
No, it's not selling well in broad America, and it's not selling well in Florida either. Let's do one number that jumped out to me. It was from a Monday poll released Monday by USA Today and Ipsos. And in that poll, I mean, first of all, I just have to say, I've been keeping track of the polling of this on mask mandates, on vaccine mandates, on anti-maskers, et cetera. And what I am seeing, I think, and I can't give you like a scientific measure of this, but I feel like I have seen public opinion grow more and more agitated and entrenched against anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers, right? So as you know, we started like in the 50 percentile of we're pro-mask mandate, you know, sort of majorities, always majorities, 55 percentile, et cetera. I feel like it's gotten up now. It's regularly, you're seeing the 60, 65% pro-mask mandate, pro-vaccine mandate in certain situations for certain kinds of workers, et cetera. And this Ipsos USA Today poll sort of summed it up for me. And in it, 70% of Americans agreed that individuals had a right to choose not to vaccinate, but they didn't have the right to be around the vaccinated, right? So just think about this. This is basically 70% of our population, our adult population right now has at least one shot, right? And more than 50% are fully vaccinated in the US. And I feel like that's like that 70% is basically saying, Sure, if you don't want to vaccinate, fine, you do you. But guess what? You don't get to be around me and the other people who have acted responsibly, not only to help our health, but to help the health of the community as we try to get back to life, right? And
Yeah.
I feel like that is a sentiment that's really taken hold among people who have done the right thing, followed the science, worked to protect themselves, their families, and their communities.
Yeah, I'm really frustrated, Carrie, that I'm having to wear a mask. Nobody loves wearing a mask. Now, to save a life, easy call. I'm even going to keep wearing a mask if I'm like in a poorly ventilated, crowded place like a subway. Because you know what? I like not getting the flu last year.
Yeah.
COVID aside, I like not getting all the other nasty stuff that normally came with living in a city. But that said, I'm really exhausted and tired of having to wear a mask when I did the right thing and the people around me did the right thing to protect the people that continue not to do the right thing. And of course, those are the people that are not wearing masks either. So the responsible have to not just bear the burden, for themselves and their communities, but they also have to bear an even bigger burden because those people aren't vaccinating. And I still don't understand. I haven't seen a real reason why, especially now that we have full FDA clearance on the Pfizer vaccine, why we're not requiring that to be inside airports, to be inside of ports, of public transportation. I'm glad to see a lot more venues, concert venues, starting to require vaccination. Some of them require a negative COVID test. That's not good enough. It's too easy to fake. You can just take a piece of paper. I can print one out right now. But it's to start making it difficult to be unvaccinated, make it uncomfortable. Now, if you live out in North Dakota and you in your farm, and I don't care, do whatever you want, have your freedom. But if you're going into my supermarket, if you're going into my airports, anywhere where I have to be because I have to interact with society, museums, what's so on, I don't think it's a big ask. I don't think, especially particularly for the kind of crowd that insists that they're not going to vaccinate because they don't know what's in that vaccine, but they're going to pump themselves up with horse dewormer, sheep and like cattle, livestock dewormer, and whatever other, cockamamie Clorox, with Donald Trump, like that. They don't have no problem with that. But they're so ideologically opposed to the vaccine, yet they're still clearly afraid of the virus itself. It's killing people. It's killing their communities. It's running rampant. So now they're looking for the alternative that isn't the vaccine, because that would admit that they were wrong the whole time. This is what we've come down to.
Or some of them are just deluded based on the, YouTube rabbit hole, Facebook rabbit hole they went down in terms of conspiracy theories, et cetera. I mean, I think since the FDA fully approved, right, the Pfizer vaccine, I wish the federal government would just aggressively do everything possible to force this on people, and not just for the sake of forcing it on people, but because public health is at stake. I mean, the reason we had this setback is because, 50% or so of the population was, or maybe a little less, but anyway, was against getting vaccinated. And because we didn't have more, much over 50% of the population fully vaccinated, we are dealing with a giant Delta surge across the country. And it's certainly worse in some regions than others, but it's affecting everyone across the country. We both live in the Bay Area. It's affected us here, even though California has a fairly high rate of vaccination. So, I think I would like to see the federal government is doing good things. Like, Joe Biden has ordered all federal workers to get vaccinated. I believe he has, the military now is going to require all active duty members to get vaccinated. But I think that they should just push through as many of those things as quickly as they can, because, Democrats, I mean, it is a matter of saving lives, number one. And number two, Democratic chances in 2022, I still think, are going to rise and fall much more on the pandemic and whether or not people feel like some semblance of normalcy has returned to their lives than it is going to fall on the Afghanistan withdrawal, right? So the more things that they can do to get more people vaccinated and to make it more difficult for people who aren't vaccinated to participate in society and get the rest of us sick, the better off we all are from a public health standpoint, and the better off Democrats will be next year when it comes to the midterms.
You know, one of the big ironies about this is, you know, sort of shifting back to the school, you know, the school fight, right, over masking in schools. I have two high school age kids, 17 and 14, and kids around town here, because in Berkeley, California, it's very not controversial to wear a mask, right? So you don't have parents railing against them. You don't have people screaming about it in stores and whatnot. Just kind of a little insulated bubble. These kids wear their masks everywhere. Like, they don't care. Like, I see them walking on the street wearing masks. And even when we had that moment where I was able to say, guys, you know, we're vaccinated, we can actually take the masks off outside, they're still wearing their masks. They don't think it's a big deal. It's normal for them to, and my son plays competitive soccer, high-level competitive soccer. He was wearing a mask. He's been wearing a mask in basic training. Now he's in basic training in Fort Benning, Georgia, infantry, wearing a mask. It's not that big of a deal. And I will never understand why it became such a cultural flashpoint. I mean, people wear helmets when they're on a bicycle. They wear seatbelts in a car. People do things for public safety. They wear shoes and a shirt when going into a dining establishment. I mean, these are not...
This is kind of off the beaten path, but you know, what's amazing is how badly a fringe piece of the GOP base, and a loud and vocal fringe piece of the GOP base, is desperate to have people lie to them. So when Trump the other night during one of his rallies said, you know, the vaccines work, I suggest you get one, you know, he didn't give like a full-throated endorsement, but he kind of like, you know, touched on it. He said, I got vaccinated, and they're all booing. They don't want to hear that the vaccines work, not even from Donald Trump. You know, you got representatives like, is it Dan Crenshaw? I can't remember. Yeah. He's a GOP member of the House. He was at a private function, I think a fundraiser, and he said, hey, don't fool yourselves. We didn't, you know, the election wasn't stolen from us. Like, we lost it. Don't delude yourself so that we lose the next election. And he got like practically booed out of the room for that. This segment, and it's a fairly large segment of the Republican Party, is desperate to be lied to, and they don't want to hear otherwise. They don't want to hear otherwise about the vaccine. They don't want to hear otherwise about, you know, their theory of the election being stolen, even though there's zero evidence to back it up. I mean, you know, they just, and let me say one other thing that really ticks me off about this, and I'm sort of all over the place, but ticks me off about this going to war with the schools by DeSantis and Abbott and Arizona Governor Doug Ducey. Like, those kids don't have a choice about whether or not they get to take a vaccine, right? So you might be able to say, well, it's personal freedom for the adults because they get to choose whether or not they get to. Those kids don't have a choice if they're under 12. They can't. They're not eligible for the vaccine. So the only protection they have is universal masking, because voluntary masking, frankly, does shit. It is not work. It has been shown. The science is so clear that you've got to universally mask. Everybody's got to be wearing a mask. And then the transmission rate drops down significantly. It's so much safer for kids to be in school. It is their last line of defense. And that is what Abbott and DeSantis and Ducey and these depraved GOP governors are trying to take away from children, is their last fucking line of defense. And it really ticks me off. Sorry, I don't drop the F-bomb that often, but just, you know, screw them, man. Seriously.
No, but they're the pro-life party, right? They're the ones that care about the children, about babies.
Oh, God.
And putting them at risk. You know, I'm glad you brought up Donald Trump's rally where he got booed for talking about vaccines. And I'll say, you're Ron DeSantis and you're Greg Abbott. They're running for president in 2 years. They see that, they're like, they're not going to go anywhere near that anymore, right? They're not going. That's a line that they're not going to step on. I will say this about Donald Trump that was really interesting, is that after he was booed, he did say like, oh, you have freedom, you have freedom. He had to repeat the whole "you have freedom," personal freedom line like 50 times, but he still said, "I got it. I still think you should get it." He actually pushed a little more than he's ever pushed, and I was surprised he even pushed to begin with.
Yeah.
I do wonder if somebody sort of slipped him like a piece of paper that showed him that the people that are now dying are his supporters. And some of these states were pretty tight. So
Yeah.
why is he systematically helping eradicate? I mean, you already had a census count that showed that the white-only population, which is the most Republican population in the country, is declining. Like literally their numbers are shrinking. It's not that they're growing at a slower pace. They are shrinking as in raw numbers to the tune of about 1% per year over the last decade. That is a calamitous collapse in the white only. There's in the white only population of this country, and that's where the Republican base really sort of comes from. And now, we saw it a bit with the withdrawal in Afghanistan, where Republicans, conservatives, instead of attacking Biden for having a chaotic retreat, have sort of reverted to racism, saying this was always the plan to bring Arabs to the United States so they could replace white people. There's this white replacement theory that's floating around in those fever swamps of the right. So now it's racism. This was all a big plan to bring Afghanis to the United States to make the United States more democratic, I guess. I don't know. Not very logical plan, but that's what they're saying. And so why would you, if you're so worried about the population of white people, about your people, and there's real fear, you can sense that fear, that fear of being overwhelmed by people that don't look like you. Clearly, it's a factor in the racism, the xenophobia, just the behavior that we're seeing on the right. Why would you kill your own? Why would you take a tact that is literally surgically at this point killing off your own supporters? So we know that the unvaccinated are what, 50% Republican, right? Democrats are about 88% vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
Florida this last week, I think, I don't remember the exact number, but it was over 500 people died. Al Gore lost Florida. Al Gore lost Florida by 250 votes.
Right.
Go ahead.
Right. Well, Florida at this point has become the first state to, during the Delta surge, to surpass their highest daily death toll during pre-vaccination times, right? So in previous surges, right? So and Texas is on the same trajectory. And let's just say what that means is that these states, under the stewardship of their governors, are in worse shape from a public health standpoint post-vaccination than they were pre-vaccination, right? They have the tools are there now. And because DeSantis and Abbott are so depraved and such terrible leaders and such panders, right? Their states are in worse shape than they were pre-vaccination.
Yeah, and it's going to get worse, Carrie, because in those previous waves, as those numbers rose, public authorities were making changes to quote flatten the curve, right? We've been hearing about flattening the curve for almost 2 years now. They were instituting mask ordinances and social distancing and closing bars and restaurants and indoor venues. None of that is happening now. So you're seeing that increase. Now, it's happening in states that are being smart about it. It's not happening in Florida, in Texas, where they are literally suing and threatening schools and businesses that are trying to protect people. And so this is not a curve that looks to be flattened anytime soon, because they are literally fighting legally, administratively, they are fighting efforts to flatten that curve. So I think we're about to hit uncharted territory. And we're also seeing this, Carrie, in South Dakota, all these Republican states, right? It's just Texas and Florida have so many people that's where the real numbers are coming out of. But we're seeing this factor in basically all of rural America. So between rural states, Republican-led states, and then even in places like California, where the rural areas just ignore the mandates from the state, right? Because city dwellers ain't going to tell them what to do, right? So okay, they're all dying off, and I don't understand why they're accelerating their exit from the electorate, to use a favorite euphemism of mine.
Here's my theory on why they're not doing that, is because none of them, they're all demagogues. None of them are actual leaders, right? None of them actually lead people. They just figure out what people want to hear, and then they tell it to them, and they do it. So my theory is, I mean, it seems stupid, but none of them are actually good enough leaders, right, to be able to steer away from what seems like a, like beaming red light saying, danger, danger, don't go this way. They don't actually have the ability to lead their flock away from it. They can only follow the flock, which is what we heard from Trump. He wasn't able to lead that discussion. He tried to push something, and then he ended up following it. And that's exactly what DeSantis and Abbott are doing. I want to ask one other thing too, though, that you mentioned. You brought up the withdrawal and the chaotic withdrawal. And I think it's worth, because right now we've got a bunch of, President Biden's approval ratings are falling, right? Mm-hmm. We've got a bunch of Democrats on the Hill. They're trying to pound out these two bills on infrastructure and jobs that would be historic. But there's reports, and I don't doubt this, having reported on the Hill and having reported in Washington, I can just see it now, that congressional Democrats are really worried about Afghanistan, the withdrawal, Biden's numbers. And I'm not saying that, these aren't significant things to take into consideration. I just wonder what your feel is on how much the withdrawal could play in next year's midterms, if really at all. I think it could be something in 2024, personally, but I don't know how. I can't say, but the midterms
policy, foreign policy very rarely impacts elections. I mean, you have the Iran hostage situation that helped Ronald Reagan back out in 1980. It's like it can happen, but it's rare. And that was a much different media environment than what we have now. And so we are so distracted by the next shiny thing that a withdrawal that was chaotic for 6-7 days, and now it's actually become pretty well oiled. I think 25,000 people were pulled out in just the last 2 days alone, which is
I think overall we're at 50,000 evacuees now.
And you had CNN reporter on the ground, 4 or 5 days ago saying they'll never get 50,000 out, right? Boom, 50,000. You still have another week left, so it happens. And so to me, it's Republicans like I said earlier, they already shifted into this racist narrative, right? That this is all about white replacement theory, and these Afghans are being brought to the U.S. to dilute Republican voting power, whatever the nonsense is, right? So they can't keep that target. So I just don't see how it's going to have any resonance, particularly since we have so much. We have over a year left, and there's going to be so much that's going to happen that this is going to be pretty well in the rearview mirror by then. So we have Secretary Castro ready to join us. So let me introduce him. Former Democratic presidential candidate, Mayor of San Antonio, and Obama-era Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Julián Castro. He's recently been pounding Abbott, Texas governor. Abbott, lack of leadership on the pandemic, among other failures, such as the big freeze of February 2021. Welcome, Secretary. And boy, is Texas becoming ground zero for the fight, isn't it?
Of course. It absolutely. I mean, it's very fitting, right? Texas, everything is big in Texas, including the controversy and including the failures of these Republican statewide leaders. They've been in charge of this state for, going basically on 30 years now. And especially this 15 months, 16 months, whatever we're at now of the pandemic, those failures have been on high display. The winter storm you mentioned, more recently, this surge of COVID, this really boneheaded, knuckleheaded refusal of the governor to allow schools to do everything that they can to protect kids. There are a lot of people who are leaving the Republican Party in Texas. They were already leaving. Trump only won the state by 5.5 points. I say only because Obama lost Texas by 16 points in 2012. So, these guys are putting on full display their failures.
Have you seen numbers that reveal that in Texas where Republicans are leaving the party there? Do you have, sort of quantitative proof of that?
I haven't seen anything in this cycle. I did last cycle that showed that their Republican identification in Texas, like nationally, actually, in the 2018-2020 cycle, was down. And you could see, maybe most importantly, the byproduct of that in the 2018 cycle. We picked up 2 congressional seats, Democrats did, 2 state Senate seats, and then also 12 House seats, and essentially held those in 2020. So y'all remember, like right after the election, there was a lot that was made about what happened in South Texas, and did some of the Hispanic, the Latino vote migrate over to Republicans? There were a couple of counties where that may have been the case, and there was some slippage. But overall, the bigger story was that the gap closed from 9 points in 2016 to 5.5 points for Biden against Trump in 2020, and everything else basically held. And I have to imagine that as bad as they've gotten in February with the winter storm, and then more recently with COVID, that they're going to continue to bleed people, especially folks in those suburbs. You can just see folks who used to be these business Republicans scratching their head saying, what in the hell happened to this party? This is not reflective of who I am or what I believe.
Yeah, and their governor's trying to get their kids killed.
Yeah.
I mean, he's literally
it's so fascinating that you have, I think, probably 70, 75 school districts, maybe more by now, that defied the governor and have passed mask mandates. Mind you, this is in not only the big cities, but also some of these rural school districts that were Trump country in 2016 and 2020. So it's like this rebellion that is spreading all over the state that's going beyond the usual suspect big cities into the suburbs and even into some of the rural areas.
So to me, the biggest tell that Republicans are really fearful that they're losing control of Texas is the fact that they just pushed through these voter restrictions, this voter suppression legislation in a special session, that they were so obsessed to make it harder to vote. And that doesn't come from a position of confidence and strength. What I do wonder, though, is the first half of the show, Secretary, we were talking about Florida, but the same thing really applies to Texas, is this obsession with making it harder to protect our children and our communities. What is the political calculation? Because we've been trying to figure this out for a while now, and nothing seems to make sense, at least not mathematical sense. Do you have any idea why Abbott is so obsessed with making children unsafe in Texas?
Well, to these Republican statewide office holders, if you don't vote in the Republican primary, they don't care about you. All they're gunning for, the only thing that they care about is winning that Republican primary, because they have gotten so overconfident that as long as they win their Republican primary, they're going to win the state. And in the case of Greg Abbott, he actually has 2 challengers in former state senator Don Huffines and former congressman and former Texas Republican Party chair Alan West. I say that with a little bit of laughter, because he was a Florida congressman that all of a sudden showed up in Texas and became the chair of the Republican Party in short order. He resigned. He's running against Greg Abbott. These 2 guys are actually seen as further to the right than Greg Abbott. Conservatives really haven't trusted Greg Abbott. The other day, y'all may have seen Ted Cruz announced at this conservative group in front of this conservative gathering that he was going to support Greg Abbott, and he got booed on stage. And the leader of the group,
I missed that.
The leader of the group showed up in this Don Huffines for Governor t-shirt. They think that he's a finger in the wind politician that doesn't really believe what they believe, that basically, will do the least amount he has to. But then, he's also, of course, not a Democrat, and he's not a principled moderate either. He's an opportunist. And so what he's trying to do right now, where he sees the opportunity, is to play like Donald Trump and to just try and win that Republican base, get them over to his side as much as possible, fend off these two hard right guys, win the primary. And then I'm sure he's going to start singing after that about, how we can all work together and this is a great growing state and I'm a governor for everybody. But I don't think that people are going to forget that he was willing to throw their kids overboard and risk their health just to win his Republican primary.
So, Secretary Castro, we have to ask you, because you recently tweeted this week, because Pfizer had approved, was fully approved by the FDA, and you tweeted about that, and you said Texas businesses should be allowed to require proof of vaccination because, of course, Abbott has done an executive order and also signed a law that punishes anyone that requires any sort of vaccine passport. And then you said, Governor Abbott has done a terrible job getting Texans vaccinated. Only 46% of the state is fully vaccinated. It's time for leadership. Who might that leader be, Secretary Castro? Are you thinking of running for something in Texas?
I mean, I've been very upfront. Like, I haven't completely taken that off the table, but it's very, very unlikely for me. I feel like I just went through this marathon of 2020, just finished running. And so, I am confident that by the December deadline, because the filing deadline is until December, that we're going to have a strong Democratic candidate. There are any number of people that if they stepped up, especially under these circumstances, I think would be not only credible, but actually strong Democratic candidates. We're in a midterm year with a Democratic president. Everybody knows that, historically the trend is challenging, but we've seen that trend bucked, right? After 9/11, for instance, for George W. Bush, you would think that if there's a cycle where Americans might buck that trend, it would be where we saw the calamity of what happened with COVID under Donald Trump, and how Joe Biden has come in and cleaned up that mess and delivered more competence, more results, shots in arms, people going back to work, the kind of government where even if people don't necessarily like government, and in Texas, of course, there are a good number of those, they recognize that you need a government that knows what it's doing, that is effective, that is competent, and that can walk and chew gum at the same time. Biden is delivering that. So perhaps we can buck that trend in 2022 here in Texas and nationally also.
Yeah, I think it helps also that Trump doesn't want to exit the limelight. So if we want to make 2022 another referendum on Donald Trump, that's actually kind of okay with me too. I think that would be very helpful. So you alluded earlier to Obama lost Texas by 15. Hillary Clinton lost it by 9. Joe Biden lost it by 5.5. The trend is clear. What do we need to do to close that last 5%? And do you see anything in the census data that might hint at what that looks like?
Yeah, the other day, the census data came out, and there was this, Texas grew by, I think, 4 million people. It's 29.1 million people now. It's growing like crazy. And I live in San Antonio. San Antonio is the 7th largest city in the country. This corridor between here and Austin just exploding with growth. The New York Times did a story on New Braunfels that they called a remote town, which really isn't remote. But that and San Marcos, they're all growing. But the most fascinating statistic in the write-ups was that for, I think the new growth, it was like 95% people of color. That was one thing. Secondly, for people under the age of 18, so basically kids, Latinos, Latinx folks already account for 48.5% of that group. And the African American community, Asian American community also growing. Both native born Texans like my brother Joaquin and I, but also a lot of people that have come from other states that expect government that is more robust, more effective, more honest, less corrupt like we've had here. All of that, I think, is changing the state. So I tweeted out to that data that I heard the Rolling Stones ringing in my ears, and like hardly anybody retweeted. Nobody got it. Like, I guess they didn't realize the song I was referencing was "Time Is on My Side." Like, it's all these like 25-year-olds on Twitter that don't, like Sawyer, who's on here, is like 29 or anyway. Yes, demographics, as people have pointed out, isn't necessarily destiny. However, there's a very clear trend. And what Democrats need to do to close that gap is to organize. Don't give up on anybody, but also bring people into the fold that haven't always been in the fold. Don't take communities of color for granted just because they voted Democratic. That's getting down to the Valley of Texas and delivering the message and competing down there. But I'm confident that we can do that here.
Yeah, Carrie, hold on. Let me ask one more follow-up on that, because it's interesting that you mentioned people coming from out of state. And I've seen Texas Republicans bragging about Austin becoming sort of this hub that is taking jobs from the Bay Area, from California, right? You have Tesla and you have Apple and you have all these, I think Google also. And I just keep thinking, do they not realize that they're importing California into Central Texas?
Yeah.
I mean, they're not bringing in Idaho, right? They're bringing in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what the deal is that is particularly not starting with, but really under Rick Perry and now under Greg Abbott, the state has thrown billions and billions of dollars at tech companies, other companies who have been relocating usually their U.S. headquarters, or if they're a U.S. company, their global headquarters to Texas. And that's bringing in a lot of people that are not from Texas, right? And it's bringing in a lot of people with different politics from where the state is at. And so in that sense, you're right that they are victims of, what they have called their success of incentivizing these companies with low taxes and low regulation and so forth. Well, okay. I mean, they're coming, and what they're doing is they're voting in people like Colin Allred and Lizzie Fletcher, in the suburbs of Dallas, in the suburbs of Houston, and any number of other people.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of congressional districts and members, so you guys picked up 2 seats, right, in the census. Given that the growth, as you say, is all in these, or mostly predominantly in these these urban and suburban areas, and the rural areas are thinning out just about everywhere across the country. How do you think that's going to affect what Republicans try to do with, with the districts, the 2 new districts? I mean, is it going to make it significantly harder for them to gerrymander, to squeeze more, more seats out? Or is it not going to be that hard for them to do what they need to do?
Well, I mean, they've been downright diabolical about it. Shameless, right? I mean, they were shameless before Donald Trump, turned shameless into basically the theme of the Republican Party for so many folks. But I mean, there's no neutral or commission style redistricting. It's going to be in the hands of a Republican governor, Republican controlled legislature, probably. In Texas, there is kind of this odd. Historically, there has been more of a working relationship between Republicans and Democrats, even sometimes on redistricting. But at the end of the day, especially on redistricting, they're going to be as partisan as they can be, and they're going to try and get away with as far as they can go. I'm sure it'll end up in court like it has the last couple of times. They'll go as far as they can to try and maximize the number of Republican seats. And even though 95% of that growth in Texas was people of color, 65% Latino, they'll try and find a way to nullify that.
So sort of taking a step back from Texas and looking at the national picture, we have this big 2022 election. Earlier, you talked about the historical trends that really run against us. Even without redistricting, we don't know what the House is going to look like, the House map. But the party that is in the White House, their first midterm, they lose an average of over 30 seats in the House. We're going to work to really offset those historical disadvantages to the extent we can. What do you think Joe Biden and Democrats in Congress need to do to maximize their chances of holding on to Congress? And I want you to sort of keep in mind that Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin exist, right? So what can we do realistically to win next year?
They need to deliver results. That's why, you know, as far as things go, I think the Biden administration is off to a fairly strong start. I mean, that's borne out in the numbers, but really it's close to the ground what they're getting accomplished, right? Getting these shots into people's arms, making sure they're healthier, reducing that anxiety that people have, especially senior citizens who are more vulnerable, making sure the economy gets back up and going, that people have a job, they're getting back to work, that they're protected from things like eviction. All of these things that people feel very intimately in their daily lives. It's not some theoretical, it's not a debate about an issue. It's, hey, look, you know, $300 showed up in my bank account when we needed it. And that's been, you know, a godsend for us to be able to provide for our kids. I like that. I like the track that the administration is on there. Obviously, elections are not only about those things, they're also about issues where there is a lot more, you know, contentiousness, and sometimes you're not going to see the results, you know, every month with a deposit in the bank account, right? But things like climate change, things like making sure that what happened to George Floyd doesn't happen again, on immigration as well. That's another issue. You need those to keep the Democratic coalition together. And so when it comes to Joe Manchin, when it comes to Kyrsten Sinema, especially when we're talking about voting rights, it means they have to figure out a way to come together and to pass a version of the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. You know, that can look different ways. It can be a compromise if it has to be. But on that and these other issues, you know, but voting rights is so essential. They have to figure out a way to come together as a caucus and to make sure that they can get these pieces of legislation through, and then amp up the base and do good work with all of these other issues, climate change, immigration, and so forth.
We can maybe get back to voting rights in a second. I do have a question though. So you're talking about deliverables, concrete things, right? You know, shots in arms, checks in people's bank accounts, et cetera. Messaging wise, do you get the sense in Texas that voters know who's responsible for that $300 child tax credit that showed up in their bank account? Do you think that messaging wise, Democrats, the Biden administration are hitting the nail on the head here? Because there's definitely been polling we've seen that has suggested otherwise.
Well, you remember, of course, all of this conversation from the Obama years, right? All the great work that the Obama administration was doing, but oftentimes, gosh, it was like there was just a inability to break through, or people were just not giving the administration credit. But I think it was both ways, right? I think if you ask a lot of folks in the administration, I served in the administration for 2.5 years, that was a real challenge, the messaging. I do think the Biden administration is building on the work of the Obama administration, doing a stronger job with messaging. The way that I always thought about it was like Obama didn't like sing his own praises and the praises of the administration and its accomplishments. And I thought as much as he should and get credit for it, whereas Trump sing his praises 100 times more than even when he didn't deliver, and lie about it and so forth. Like, you know, you got to be more toward Obama, but in the area of actually, you know, being truthful. But then also, you look. I mean, in our day and age, you got to be a salesman or saleswoman. You as president, and you have to sell it. And this administration and future administrations, I think, do have to step up their messaging. But the good news is that what the administration has to sell is substance. It's there. And so that's less of a hard sell than a lot of other things.
Yeah, one of the big frustrations is Donald Trump put his name on the relief checks, right? And then Joe Biden came in and we're not going to do that. It's unseemly. And it is unseemly, but still, you fight fire with fire. You do the same thing. You brand it, and if Congress doesn't like it, they can change it. And I'm sure Joe Biden would have been happy to sign that law. But frustrations. Carrie, you wanted to talk more about voters' rights.
Well, I thought you wanted to talk more about voters' rights.
It's just
well, I mean, look, you guys just, I mean, you guys are ground zero for so many things: the COVID fight, the voting rights, etc. You just
y'all need to just move down to Texas. And
we're going
over here.
Yeah, we're going to be on location in Texas next week. We have had a few folks from Texas on, so
no, I mean, what's happened? The New York Times a couple of months ago just dispatched like 3 new journalists throughout the state. Now, 3 journalists in the scope of all the New York Times people is nothing, or journalists in general. But it is happening. I mean, the state, I think, unfortunately, too many times in bad ways. But look, we really are just on the doorstep of when this state does flip over, and it is going to flip over. I mean, you can tell that when it flips over, instead of being in so many ways a bad example, think about how powerful a good example the state is actually going to be one day. And that's what, I try to hang on to and keep thinking about, even as we have to deal with all of these folks that are trying to take us backward.
So, Secretary, what are you focusing on right now? What's your day-to-day work focused on?
Yeah, so just about a month and a half ago, I became a MSNBC and NBC News political analyst. I'm doing that, and we also still have our PAC and supporting good work of folks out there, progressive causes and efforts. I have my podcast, Our America. We finished the first season in April, and our second season is starting in October. And then, my wife Erica and I have our 2 kids, Christian and Karina, and they keep us very busy as well. I think for a lot of people, the one silver lining of the pandemic time period has been getting to actually spend a lot more time at home, because I was on the road so often at HUD, and then of course during the presidential campaign, that it was good to be able to settle down and actually get to see my kids grow up a little bit.
And how old are they?
My daughter's 12 and my son is 6.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so good ages. Well, we're about to lose my daughter to teenagehood, but other than that,
brace yourself. That's where I'm at.
Fortunately, she'll still let me walk her, close to the school. But I get the cold shoulder about like 30 yards away from the door right now. That's just going to get like longer and longer away soon.
Yes.
I feel compelled to ask you because I know, your brother, I'm sure that your brother and you are on the phone daily telling each other what they think. I'm kidding. But anyway, I know that he's among some of the Texas Democrats who have been critical of the chaos surrounding the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the evacuation. How do we discussed earlier before you came on whether or not we thought this would affect 2022, if at all. But what's your view on that? I mean, these are images that, that are chaotic. They're heart-wrenching in some cases. On the other hand, at least 50,000 evacuees have already made it out safely. What's your theory on how this could affect 2022?
Yeah, there is no question that in the last few days, the last couple of days, that the administration and really our military has shown this tremendous amount of ability and of concern for Americans who are there and also our allies, and they've done a much better job of getting an orderly evacuation going. You mentioned 50,000 people over several days. So, I mean, it is up and going. I think at the beginning of it, because of the images and also this sense with the special immigrant visas, for instance, and I think in some cases not bringing people a little bit earlier when it was known that there was going to be a withdrawal, there was I think some of it was legitimate critique, but overall it seems like they've gotten their footing back. My word of concern to the administration would be that on refugees, asylees, and on migrants, that we need to have a positive, strong vision of our own for what that looks like. Because we can't let Donald Trump's policies become the default for how we approach things. Whether it's the fact that this year there have only been over 6,000 refugees that have actually come into the United States until these ones started arriving very recently, or keeping Title 42, for instance, in place, which had never been used before on the border and was resisted at the beginning by the CDC. I think Joe Biden has a really good heart for folks like refugees in Afghanistan that help the United States, or for migrants who are seeking a better life. And my hope is that they'll make it a priority to ensure that these systems are in place to strike compassion with common sense, and of course the fact that if every nation has borders and they're going to be enforced. I think there is some work to do still there in the administration overall.
So, Secretary Castro, what was the name of your podcast again?
It's called Our America, and
Our
the
America.
second season will start I think the second week of October.
Fantastic. Everybody check out Our America with Julián Castro. Secretary Castro, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure to visit with you. And hopefully we'll check in maybe in a few months and talk about Texas after we start getting some candidates, really feel about the lay of the land. And let's talk about how we're going to win Texas next year.
I hope so. Hey, thank you all. And thank you for what you do. It's good to be with you.
Thank you so much. So he did a good job of claiming he's not running next year.
He did. I almost believed him.
The history of
I'm just kidding.
Candidates who claim not to be running is legion. So I would never take a denial as a hard fact. Reality is that there are great Democrats in Texas. There aren't a lot of Democrats with really strong national profiles that I think would raise the kind of money you need in Texas. There's a few. Beto O'Rourke obviously comes to mind, and I really, hope. But a Beto Julián ticket, governor, lieutenant governor, or flip them, doesn't really matter. In Texas, a little fun fact is that the lieutenant governor actually has more power than the governor. But you have attorney general's race. You have the entire executive ticket in Texas is up for re-election. It's up for election next year. And so we're going to need a strong representative slate and having some high profile national names that will sit there and raise the money that we need. Texas is an insanely expensive state to run in. That's one of the challenges that Democrats have in flipping it. It's just how expensive it can be. But beyond that, anything else strike you? We have a couple of minutes.
No, I think, look, if you were young and ambitious politician in Texas, next year might be a year that you would want to prosecute a campaign against, Texas Republicans who have, presided over the big freeze of February 2021, who have presided over a raging COVID, resurgence,
which
in
is
their
only going to
state,
get worse. It's not getting any better.
Which is only going to get worse. You have population centers that are growing, that they may be able to gerrymander in congressional districts. Republicans may be able to gerrymander congressional districts and state legislative districts and whatever, but they can't gerrymander the whole state. It's like, so if you're a young and ambitious politician with name recognition, I'd sure as heck think twice about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't know what districts Republicans are gonna draw, and they have some conundrums too, because those rural areas that they used to that are the bulk of their sort of House majority in the state, they've emptied out. They are emptying out. And so they used to lean heavily on the suburbs, but the suburbs have become either competitive or Democratic. And then they had this sort of next layer challenge, because do they look at the 2018 results when Trump voters did not turn out, or they look at 2020 maps when the Trump voters did come out? And it's a whole different equation whatsoever. So they're going to have to make some real decisions on what data they're going to use, what voters they can assume will turn out in the future. Because say they draw maps to maximize Republicans based on 2020 numbers when Trump voters came out, and then those voters don't turn out, you have a much different, outcome.
Sure.
So I think Texas Republicans have some real challenges. And again, the fact that they are voting to suppress the vote tells you all you need to know, because
Right.
Democrats in California, they're not voting to suppress the vote because they're not worried
Right.
about winning elections fair and square, right? I mean, when you see a party starting to suppress the vote, that's when you know they've lost the popular vote or popular support, and they're
Sure.
using mechanical institutional means to retain power. So, Carrie, that's our show for today. Thank you so much for being my co-host. Thank you to Walter Einenkel for producing the show. Kara Salaya for helping out with the social media. Thank you for watching every Tuesday. You can follow us on Twitter at Daily Coz. Please like, subscribe, whether it's YouTube or Facebook Live or your favorite podcasting platform. Make sure you follow, like, and review. Thank you so much. See you next week.